The auditorium smelled like old wood and nervous energy. It was one of those fancy concert halls where every sound seemed to echo twice, and the red velvet seats looked like they cost more than most people's cars. Outside, autumn leaves were falling, but inside dozens of young musicians sat clutching their instruments waiting for their turn to prove themselves. This wasn't just any audition. This was for the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra, the kind of place where future concert pianists and symphony musicians got their start. Parents had driven for hours. Some kids had been preparing for months with expensive private teachers. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes, carrying instrument cases that probably cost thousands of dollars. Near the back of the waiting area sat a 12-year-old boy who didn't quite fit the picture. His jacket was a bit too big, clearly a hand-me-down. His sneakers had seen better days. While other kids practiced scales and ran through their pieces one more time, he just sat there quietly, his hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing in particular. The other parents didn't pay much attention to him. There was no proud mother fussing over his collar or father giving last-minute advice. He'd come alone on 2 buses carrying nothing but a folder with some sheet music inside. To everyone else in that room, he was basically invisible. At the front of the auditorium, director Vladimir Petrov sat behind a long table with 2 other judges. Petrov was a legend in the classical music world. 60 years old with wild gray hair and intense eyes that seemed to look right through you. He'd trained musicians who now played in orchestras around the world. He was known for 2 things: spotting extraordinary talent and having absolutely no patience for mediocrity. Next, Petrov's voice boomed across the hall. He'd been listening to auditions for 3 hours straight, and his patience was wearing thin. A girl walked up with her violin. She played beautifully. Petrov barely looked up from his notes. Adequate. Next. A boy performed a challenging cello piece. Technically perfect. Petrov yawned. You play like a robot. Next. This went on and on. Petrov had heard it all before. These kids were good, sure. Their parents had paid for the best teachers money could buy. But something was missing. There was no soul, no fire, no reason to believe any of them would ever make an audience feel something real. The assistant director leaned over and whispered something about taking a break. Petrov waved him off. Let's finish this list. How many more? 7, came the reply. Petrov sighed and glanced down at his clipboard. His eyes landed on the next name. No fancy music school listed. No impressive teacher recommendations. Just a simple application that said self-taught where it asked about formal training. He showed it to his assistant director and let out a short, bitter laugh. Self-taught? What is this, a joke? The assistant director shrugged. Should we just skip it? Before Petrov could answer, the boy from the back of the room stood up and started walking toward the piano. His footsteps echoed in the quiet hall. Some of the other kids nudged each other and whispered. A few parents looked up from their phones, curious about who was next. The boy walked slowly, his shoulders slightly hunched, like he was trying to make himself even smaller than he already was. When he reached the grand piano sitting in the middle of the stage, he looked absolutely tiny next to it. The piano was one of those concert grands, shiny black, worth more than a house. Petrov watched him approach with growing amusement. This ought to be interesting, he thought. The kid looked like he'd never even seen a piano this expensive, let alone played one. Name? Petrov called out, not even trying to hide the skepticism in his voice. The boy stated his name clearly, though his voice was soft. He didn't look nervous exactly, more like he was somewhere else entirely in his mind. And where did you study? Petrov asked, though he already knew the answer from the application. I taught myself, sir. A few snickers rippled through the waiting area. One mother actually laughed out loud before covering her mouth. Petrov's assistant director rolled his eyes and started packing up his bag, clearly ready to wrap this up quickly. Petrov leaned back in his chair, a smirk spreading across his face. He'd been in this business long enough to spot a waste of time. This kid probably learned a few simple songs from YouTube and thought he could walk into a prestigious orchestra audition. The arrogance of it was almost amusing. He looked at his fellow judges, then at the audience of waiting families, and decided to have a little fun with the situation. His voice carried across the entire auditorium, loud enough for everyone to hear. You know what? Petrov announced, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I'll tell you what. If this boy can actually play the piano, I mean really play it, I'll fall to my knees right here. I'll get down on the floor in front of everyone." Laughter erupted from several corners of the room. Some people tried to stifle it, but the damage was done. The other musicians waiting for their turn exchanged glances. A few parents shook their heads in second-hand embarrassment for the boy. But Petrov wasn't finished. He was on a roll now, enjoying his own performance. Self-taught? Can you imagine? Do you know how long it takes to train a proper pianist? Years, decades. And this kid thinks he can just walk in here. The boy stood at the piano bench completely still. His face showed no emotion. He didn't look angry or embarrassed or hurt. He simply waited for the laughter to die down, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the piano. Something about that stillness made a few people in the audience uncomfortable. The way he stood there, absorbing the mockery without flinching, was almost eerie. It was the stillness of someone who'd heard worse before, or maybe the stillness of someone who knew something nobody else in that room knew. Petrov finally stopped laughing and waved his hand dismissively. All right. Go ahead then. Play something. Let's see what self-taught sounds like. Try not to break my piano." More scattered laughter. The assistant director wasn't even looking anymore. He was checking his phone, ready to call up the next real audition. The boy pulled out the piano bench and sat down. He adjusted the height carefully, his movements deliberate and precise. Then he placed his folder of sheet music on the stand in front of him. His hands hovered over the keys for just a moment. In that moment, the entire atmosphere in the room seemed to shift somehow. It was subtle, like the air pressure changing before a storm. A few people stopped talking. The boy's posture had changed. His shoulders were back now. His hands were positioned over the keyboard with absolute confidence, and then he began to play. The first note cut through the auditorium like lightning. 6 months earlier, the boy's life looked completely different. He lived in a run-down apartment building on the east side of the city, the kind of place where the elevator only worked half the time, and the hallway lights flickered like something out of a horror movie. His mother worked 2 jobs, one at a diner during the day and another cleaning offices at night. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. The building was old, probably built sometime in the 1960s, with thin walls and creaky floors. Most people who lived there were just trying to get by. There were families from all over the world, speaking different languages, cooking different foods. The kids played in the courtyard after school while their parents worked long hours. One afternoon, the boy was exploring the basement. Most kids avoided it because it was dark and smelled like mildew. But he liked quiet places where he could think. That's when he found it, pushed into a corner behind some broken furniture and cardboard boxes. An old upright piano. It wasn't anything fancy. The wood was scratched and faded. Some of the keys were chipped. There was dust so thick on top that he could write his name in it. Someone had clearly dumped it there years ago, probably thinking it was worthless. But when he pressed one of the keys, it still made a sound. Not a perfect sound, but a sound nonetheless. He sat down on an old crate and pressed another key. Then another. He didn't know anything about music, couldn't read a single note, but something about those sounds fascinated him. Each key had its own voice. When he pressed them together, they talked to each other. Some combinations sounded beautiful, others sounded terrible, but all of it was interesting. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the piano. The next day after school, he went back to the basement. And the day after that, and the day after that. Pretty soon, he was spending every free moment down there in that dusty corner, pressing keys and listening. His mother noticed he wasn't hanging out with other kids anymore. "What do you do down there all day?" she asked one evening while they ate dinner, which was usually something simple like rice and beans or pasta. "There's a piano," he said. "I'm trying to figure out how it works." She looked worried. Money was always tight, and she couldn't afford music lessons even if she'd wanted to. "Just be careful, okay? Don't get your hopes up about things we can't afford." But he wasn't thinking about lessons or teachers. He just wanted to understand the piano. He started going to the public library and checking out books about music. The librarian, a kind woman who remembered everyone's name, showed him where to find them. Basic music theory, books about famous composers, instruction manuals that were older than his mother. He'd read these books, then go back to the basement and try to apply what he'd learned. The piano was missing a few strings and some keys stuck when he pressed them, but he didn't care. He'd practice for hours, his fingers getting sore, his back aching from sitting on that uncomfortable crate. The building superintendent was a man named Rodriguez. He was probably in his 60s, walked with a slight limp and hardly ever talked to anyone. But he noticed everything. He'd see the boy going down to the basement every single day like clockwork. One afternoon, the boy found something new next to the piano. A book about jazz theory. It definitely hadn't been there before. He looked around the basement, but no one was there. The next week, another book appeared. Then some sheet music. Old, yellowed pages with notes that looked like tiny birds sitting on telephone wires. The boy never saw who was leaving these things, but he had his suspicions. Sometimes when he was practicing, he'd hear footsteps on the stairs. They'd pause for a moment just listening, then continue on. He'd glance over, but whoever it was would already be gone. He started using his mother's old phone to listen to classical music. He didn't have money for streaming services, so he'd find free recordings on the internet. He'd listen to a piece dozens of times, memorizing every note, every pause, every emotion. Then he'd go down to the basement and try to recreate it. It was frustrating at first. His fingers wouldn't do what his brain wanted them to do. The sounds coming from the piano didn't match the sounds in his head. But slowly, week by week, month by month, something started to click. His fingers learned where to go. His ears learned what to listen for. The piano stopped being a mystery and started becoming a language he could speak. His mother worked so hard. He'd see her come home exhausted, her feet hurting, her eyes tired. She never complained, but he could tell. She'd worked her whole life and had nothing to show for it except bills and worries. Sometimes he'd hear her crying quietly in her room when she thought he was asleep. That's when he made a decision. Her birthday was coming up in a few months. He wanted to give her something special. Not something bought from a store, but something real. Something that would show her that all her sacrifices meant something. He saw a flyer at the library about youth orchestra auditions. The Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. He'd heard of it before. It was famous. Kids who got in often went on to study at prestigious music schools. Some became professional musicians. The audition was open to anyone, but he knew the competition would be fierce. Kids who'd been taking lessons since they were 5 years old. Kids with expensive instruments and professional teachers. Kids whose parents could afford to drive them to competitions and recitals all over the country. But he had something else. He had 6 hours a day of practice on that basement piano. He had hunger. He had a reason bigger than himself. He chose his piece carefully. It was a challenging composition, something that would make the judges take notice if he could pull it off. Most kids his age wouldn't even attempt it. But he'd been practicing it for weeks, breaking it down section by section, measure by measure, note by note. Rodriguez started leaving more advanced music around this time. Complicated pieces by composers whose names the boy could barely pronounce. Sometimes there'd be little notes in the margins, tiny corrections or suggestions written in faded pencil. The boy studied these notes like they were sacred texts. One evening, as he was leaving the basement, Rodriguez was there at the top of the stairs. They looked at each other for a long moment. The old man's eyes were kind but sad, like he was remembering something from long ago. "Keep going," Rodriguez said quietly. That was all. Then he turned and walked away. The boy kept practicing. His fingers developed calluses. His back hurt from sitting on that crate for hours. His mother asked him if he was okay because he seemed so focused all the time, so far away in his own world. "I'm fine, Mom," he'd say. "I'm working on something." The day before the audition, he went down to the basement one last time. He played his piece from beginning to end, pouring everything into it. Every frustration, every hope, every ounce of love he had for his mother who sacrificed everything. When he finished, he heard a sound behind him. Rodriguez was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and the old man's eyes were wet with tears. "You're ready," Rodriguez said. Then he handed the boy something. It was an old photograph of a young man sitting at a piano in a nightclub, holding a trumpet. The young man looked happy. It took the boy a moment to realize he was looking at Rodriguez, maybe 40 years ago. "I used to play," Rodriguez said, "before life got in the way. I hear what you're doing down here. You got something special. Don't let anyone tell you different." The next morning, the boy took 2 buses to the audition, carrying nothing but his sheet music and the memory of every hour he'd spent in that basement. The first note hung in the air like a question nobody expected to be asked. It was clear. Perfect. The kind of sound that makes you stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. Petrov's smirk started to fade. Just slightly. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. That single note had been too good, too controlled. Maybe it was just beginner's luck, but then came the second note. And the third, and suddenly the boy's hands were moving across the keyboard with a confidence that didn't match his worn-out sneakers or his too big jacket. His left hand established a deep, rolling pattern in the bass notes while his right hand began to sing out a melody that seemed to float above it all. The scattered conversations in the auditorium died immediately. A mother who'd been texting looked up from her phone. A boy who'd been practicing fingering patterns on his lap stopped moving. Even Petrov's assistant director, who'd been ready to pack up and leave, froze with his hand halfway to his briefcase. The piece the boy was playing wasn't some simple beginner's song. It was a legitimate classical composition, the kind that music students spend years working up to. The kind that requires not just technical skill, but deep understanding, and he was playing it like he'd been born knowing it. His fingers danced across the keys with impossible precision. There were runs that moved so fast they seemed to blur together, yet every single note was crystal clear. There were delicate passages where he barely touched the keys, drawing out sounds so soft they were almost whispers. Then there were powerful chords that made the whole piano resonate, filling the auditorium with sound so rich you could almost feel it in your chest. But it wasn't just the technical skill that was shocking, it was the feeling behind it. Most of the young musicians who'd auditioned that day played like they were trying to impress someone. They played the right notes at the right time, but their performances felt empty, like reading words from a book without understanding what they meant. This boy was different. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was having a conversation with the piano, and they both seemed to know exactly what they were saying to each other. Every phrase had intention. Every pause meant something. When the music got sad, you could feel the sadness. When it got angry, you could feel the tension. When it got hopeful, you wanted to believe in hope again. Petrov sat completely still now, his mouth slightly open. In 30 years of teaching and judging, he'd heard thousands of auditions. He'd heard students from the best music schools in the world. He'd heard prodigies who'd been trained since they could walk. But this was something else entirely. The boy's whole body moved with the music. Not in a showy way, but naturally, like the music was flowing through him and he was just the channel it chose to come out through. His eyes were closed now. His face showed absolute concentration, but also something like peace. For these few minutes, nothing else existed for him. Not the fancy auditorium. Not the judgmental director. Not the other kids who'd laughed at him. Just the music. Other musicians in the room recognized what they were witnessing. A violinist who'd auditioned earlier and thought she'd done well suddenly felt inadequate. A cellist who'd been confident about getting accepted now wasn't so sure. They were technically proficient, sure. They'd followed all the rules. But this boy was making them realize there was a difference between playing music and being music. The piece built in intensity. The boy's hands moved faster, jumping across the keyboard with absolute certainty. His left hand played complex rhythms that seemed impossible for someone his age to coordinate, while his right hand soared above it all, telling a story that didn't need words. A woman in the third row felt tears running down her face and didn't even realize it until one dripped onto her hand. She didn't know why she was crying. The music was just beautiful in a way that made something inside her chest ache, like it was reminding her of something she'd forgotten long ago. Petrov gripped the edge of the table in front of him. His knuckles were white. His heart was pounding. This wasn't supposed to happen. This kid was supposed to play a few clumsy notes, maybe stumble through some basic song, and then they'd all move on. But instead, he was sitting here witnessing something that most people in the music world spent their entire lives hoping to find: raw talent, undiscovered, untainted by years of rigid classical training that sometimes squeezed all the life out of a performance. This boy played with the technical skill of someone who'd studied for years, but with the soul of someone who'd discovered music on his own and fallen completely in love with it. The music reached its climactic section. The boy's hands were flying now, moving with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost superhuman. The piano sang and thundered and whispered and roared. Every emotion you could name was in there somewhere, woven into the fabric of the composition. And through it all, the boy remained completely absorbed. Sweat formed on his forehead. his breathing synchronized with the phrases of the music. In this moment, he wasn't a poor kid from the East Side with hand-me-down clothes and no formal training. He was a musician, a real one, the kind that only comes along once in a great while. The other judges at the table had stopped taking notes. They just watched, their pens hovering uselessly over their papers. What were they supposed to write? How do you capture something like this in a few words? How do you score something that transcends the whole idea of scoring? As the piece moved toward its conclusion, the boy's playing became even more nuanced. He shaped every phrase with absolute intention, building the tension, making everyone in that room lean forward without realizing it. The music pulled you along like a river current, and all you could do was surrender to it. The final section arrived, complex chords that required both hands to stretch across the keyboard, notes that had to be timed perfectly to create the right resonance. It was the kind of ending that could make or break a performance. If you rushed it, it sounded messy. If you were too careful, it lost its power. The boy did neither. He played it exactly as it needed to be played, with confidence and grace and absolute certainty. The music swelled one final time, filling every corner of the auditorium, vibrating through the floor and the walls and the fancy red velvet seats. And then came the final chord. Both hands came down together, striking the keys with perfect force. Not too hard, not too soft, just right. The sound exploded through the hall, rich and full and complete. The boy held the chord, letting it ring out, sustaining the pedal so the notes blended together into one perfect sound. Slowly, gradually, he released the pressure, letting the sound fade naturally. The notes hung in the air, getting softer and softer until finally they disappeared into silence. The boy's hands lifted from the keys. He opened his eyes. For a moment he seemed disoriented, like he was waking up from a dream and wasn't quite sure where he was. Then reality came back. The auditorium. The judges. The audience. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The moment stretched out, becoming almost uncomfortable in its intensity. Then from the back of the room someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then everyone. The applause started as scattered individual responses, but quickly built into something massive. People weren't just clapping politely. They were on their feet. Parents who'd never seen this kid before in their lives were applauding like he was their own son. Musicians who'd been his competition were clapping so hard their hands hurt. And at the judges' table, director Vladimir Petrov sat completely still, staring at the boy with an expression that was hard to read. His face had gone pale. His eyes were wet. His mouth was still slightly open. Slowly, very slowly, the legendary director pushed back his chair and stood up. Petrov stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the boy. The applause continued around him, but he didn't seem to hear it. His whole world had narrowed down to that small figure sitting at the piano, looking confused and a little scared by all the attention. Then, without saying a word, Petrov stepped out from behind the judges' table. His footsteps echoed as he walked toward the stage. Everyone in the auditorium went quiet again, watching to see what the legendary director would do. Some people looked nervous. They'd never seen Petrov like this before. When he reached the piano, Petrov stood there for a moment, looking down at the boy. His face was impossible to read. The boy swallowed hard, probably thinking he'd done something wrong, probably preparing himself for criticism. Then Vladimir Petrov, the man who'd judged thousands of auditions and made grown musicians cry with his harsh words, slowly lowered himself to one knee. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." The assistant director's clipboard clattered to the floor. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. Petrov stayed there on one knee, looking up at the boy with tears streaming down his face. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, completely different from the mocking tone he'd used just minutes earlier. "I stand corrected," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Young man, I owe you an apology. Where did you learn to play like that?" The boy looked around nervously, like he thought maybe this was some kind of trick. His voice came out small and uncertain. "There's a piano. In my building. In the basement. I taught myself." Petrov shook his head slowly, like he couldn't process what he was hearing. "You taught yourself this? This piece? This technique?" "Yes, sir. I used books from the library, and I listened to recordings on my phone. I practiced every day. Every day for how long? About 6 months. Sometimes 6 or 7 hours? Petrov closed his eyes and put his hand over his heart. When he opened them again, there was something like pain in his expression. Do you understand what you are? Do you have any idea? The boy shook his head. He genuinely didn't understand what was happening. In 30 years, Petrov said, his voice breaking slightly. In 30 years of teaching, I have never heard anything like what I just heard. Never. I've taught students who went to Juilliard, students who now play in the best orchestras in the world. But what you just did, he paused, struggling to find words. That wasn't just playing piano. That was speaking truth. That was pure music, uncorrupted by ego or expectation or anyone telling you how you're supposed to feel. The boy didn't know what to say to that. So he just sat there, his hands still trembling slightly from the performance. Petrov stood up, his old knees creaking slightly. He turned to face the entire auditorium. You all heard what I said before he played. I mocked him. I laughed at him. I said I would fall to my knees if he could really play. He gestured to the floor. Well, I kept my word, but I didn't kneel for him. I knelt for what he represents, for what music should be. He turned back to the boy. What's your name again? Tell everyone. The boy said his name, still looking overwhelmed by everything. Listen to me, Petrov said, putting his hand on the boy's shoulder. You are not only accepted into this orchestra, you are going to be our featured soloist for the winter concert, and furthermore, I am personally ensuring that you receive a full scholarship to study at the conservatory. More gasps from the crowd. A full scholarship to the conservatory was worth tens of thousands of dollars. It was the kind of opportunity that changed lives. But sir, the boy said quietly, I can't afford. You don't understand. Petrov interrupted gently. You won't pay anything. Not a single cent, I'll make sure of it. You'll have access to the best teachers, the best instruments, everything you need. And he paused, seeming to make a decision. I would like to work with you myself if you'll allow it. The boy's eyes went wide. You want to teach me? I want to learn from you, Petrov corrected. You've reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Why I fell in love with music in the first place, before all the competitions and the politics and the ego. You play the way I used to dream of playing when I was young. The other judges were nodding in agreement. One of them, an older woman who'd been stern and critical all day, was wiping tears from her eyes. She stood up and started clapping again, and soon everyone joined in. Another standing ovation. The boy looked like he might faint. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to kids like him. Kids from rundown buildings with hand-me-down clothes. Kids whose mothers worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. I need to tell my mom, the boy said suddenly. She doesn't even know I'm here. She's at work. His voice cracked. She works so hard. I wanted to play for her birthday. I wanted to show her that everything she does matters. Petrov's expression softened even more. Call her. Right now. Use my phone. The boy took the phone with shaking hands. He dialed his mother's number, the one he'd memorized years ago. It rang 3 times before she answered. Hello? Mom, it's me. Baby? Why are you calling from a strange number? Are you okay? Did something happen? The worry in her voice was immediate. I'm okay, Mom. I went to an audition. For a youth orchestra. Silence on the other end. Then what, when? How did you? I've been practicing. On the old piano in the basement. I wanted it to be a surprise for your birthday. He heard her breath catch. Oh, sweetheart. Mom, I got in. I got a scholarship. A full scholarship to study music, and they want me to perform in a concert. The sound that came through the phone wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. Are you serious? You're not joking with me? I'm serious. The director wants to talk to you. Petrov took the phone. Hello, ma'am. My name is Vladimir Petrov. I'm the director of the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. He listened for a moment. Yes, ma'am, this is real. Your son just gave the most remarkable audition I've seen in my entire career. He has a gift. A profound gift. Another pause. No, you won't owe anything. I'm making sure of that personally. He smiled. Yes, ma'am, he told me. And I can assure you, everything you've sacrificed for him has absolutely mattered. When he handed the phone back, the boy could hear his mother crying on the other end. I'm so proud of you, she managed to say. I'm so proud. I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby. So much. After he hung up, the boy just sat there holding the phone, trying to process everything. Petrov gave him a moment, then said, Come, let me introduce you to the other musicians. They'll be your family for the next few months. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Other kids who'd been his competition now wanted to shake his hand. Parents asked for his story. The assistant director apologized for doubting him. Someone brought cookies and someone else brought juice boxes, and suddenly there was an impromptu celebration happening. A girl about his age, who'd played violin earlier, came up to him. "That was amazing," she said. "How did you do it?" "I've been taking lessons for 8 years and I've never played anything that made me feel the way your music made me feel." The boy thought about it. I think about what the music is trying to say, and I try to help it say it." She looked at him like he'd said something profound, but to him it was just obvious. That's what music was for, wasn't it? To say the things that were too big for regular words? Petrov watched all this from across the room, talking quietly with the other judges. "I've been doing this wrong," he admitted. "All these years focusing so much on technique and perfection that I forgot about soul. That boy just taught me more about music in 10 minutes than I've learned in the last decade." The other judges agreed. They'd all felt it. The reminder that music wasn't about impressing people or following rules. It was about connection, about truth, about finding something inside yourself and letting it out in a way that touches other people. As the sun started to set outside the auditorium windows, Petrov called everyone to attention one more time. "Before we end today, I want to say something to all of you. You're all talented. You've all worked hard. But I want you to remember what you witnessed here today. That boy didn't have expensive lessons or fancy teachers or perfect conditions. What he had was love for music. Pure, honest love. And that made all the difference." He looked at the boy. "Thank you. You gave me a gift today. You gave all of us a gift. You reminded us why we do this." The boy didn't feel like he'd given anyone anything. He just played the piano the way he always did, the way that made sense to him. But seeing all these people looking at him with respect and admiration and even love, he started to understand that maybe, just maybe, his music meant something to people beyond himself. Maybe his mother's sacrifices really had mattered. Maybe all those hours in the dusty basement hadn't been wasted. Maybe dreams could come true even for kids like him. The months following the audition felt like living in a dream that the boy kept expecting to wake up from, but every morning it was still real. The scholarship was real. The orchestra rehearsals were real. Director Petrov's personal mentorship was real. The first few weeks were the hardest. Suddenly he was surrounded by kids who'd been studying music their whole lives. They talked about concepts he'd never heard of. They read sheet music as easily as reading a book. They had techniques he'd figured out on his own. But they had proper names for everything and knew the right way to do things. At first, he felt stupid, lost, like maybe everyone would realize they'd made a mistake accepting him. But Petrov saw the doubt in his eyes during their first private lesson. The director sat down next to him at the conservatory's grand piano, much nicer than the one in the auditorium, infinitely nicer than the broken upright in his basement. "You're questioning yourself," Petrov said. It wasn't a question, the boy nodded. "Everyone here is so good. They know so much. You're just the most naturally gifted musician I've met in 30 years, Petrov interrupted. "Yes, they know the technical terms. Yes, they've had formal training. But you have something they're still trying to learn. You have soul. You have honesty. Don't lose that trying to become like everyone else. But I need to learn the proper way." "You need to learn the tools," Petrov corrected. "Music theory, sight reading, proper technique for your hands so you don't injure yourself. These are tools. But tools are useless if you forget why you're building something in the first place. You understand?" The boy thought about it. "So I should learn the technical stuff but not let it change how I feel about the music?" "Exactly. Let me teach you the language of music. But never forget that you already know how to speak it. Most people spend years learning the vocabulary and grammar and never figure out how to actually say anything meaningful." So that's what they did. Petrov taught him theory and technique, how to read complex sheet music, how to position his hands to avoid strain, the history of different composers and musical periods, all the formal knowledge that the other students had been learning for years, but he never stopped being himself. When he played, he still poured his heart into it. He still thought about what the music meant, not just what the notes were. And slowly the other students started to notice something. They'd been trained to play correctly. He played truthfully. There was a difference. The winter concert approached faster than anyone expected. It would be held in the city's main concert hall, a beautiful old building that seated over 1,000 people. The boy would be the featured soloist, performing the same piece he'd played at his audition, plus another more advanced composition. His mother managed to get the night off from both her jobs. She'd never done that before, not in all the years he could remember. She bought a new dress for the occasion, something simple but nice from a thrift store. When he saw her trying it on at home, he thought she looked beautiful. "I can't believe this is happening," she said, adjusting the collar. "My baby, performing in front of all those people." "I'm nervous," he admitted. "You should be. That means you care." She came over and hugged him tight. "But remember, you've already done the hard part. You learned to play from nothing. You taught yourself something that most people need years of expensive lessons to learn. Everything else is just showing people what you already know how to do." The night of the concert, the boy arrived early. The concert hall was even more intimidating when it was empty, row after row of seats stretching back into shadows. The stage lights were so bright they made everything beyond the first few rows disappear into darkness. Petrov found him standing in the wings, staring out at the empty hall. "Scared? Terrified? Good. Fear means you respect what you're about to do, but don't let it control you. When you sit down at that piano tonight, forget about the audience. Just talk to the music like you always do." The hall filled up slowly. Parents, teachers, music lovers from around the city. Word had spread about the self-taught prodigy who'd made director Petrov kneel. People were curious. Some were skeptical. Maybe it had been a fluke. Maybe the story had been exaggerated. Rodriguez came, wearing the same suit he'd worn the day of the audition. He sat near the back, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When the boy peeked through the curtain and saw him there, he felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost knocked him over. This man who'd left books and sheet music in a basement for a kid he barely knew. This man who'd believed in him before anyone else did. His mother sat in the front row, clutching her program so tight it wrinkled. Her eyes were already shiny with tears, and the concert hadn't even started yet. The orchestra performed several pieces first. They were good, really good. The audience clapped enthusiastically. But there was a feeling in the air, an anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the boy. Finally, Petrov walked to the center of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, for our final pieces of the evening, I have the honor of introducing a very special young musician. Several months ago, this young man walked into an audition with no formal training, no prestigious teachers, no advantages. He'd taught himself to play on a broken piano in a basement. And he played with such honesty and soul that he reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." Petrov's voice got softer. He reminded all of us that music isn't about perfection, it's about truth. It's about taking something you feel inside and sharing it with the world. Tonight he's going to share that gift with all of you. Please welcome our featured soloist. The applause was warm as the boy walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding. He could see his mother in the front row, tears already streaming down her face. He could feel 1,000 eyes watching him. His heart hammered in his chest. He sat at the piano. It was beautiful. Perfectly tuned, nothing like the beaten-up upright in his basement. For a second he panicked. What if he couldn't do it? What if the audition had been luck? What if he'd forgotten everything? Then he placed his fingers on the keys and everything else fell away. This was just him and the piano, having a conversation like they'd had 1,000 times before. It didn't matter that there were people watching. It didn't matter that this was a fancy concert hall. The music was the same. The feeling was the same. He began to play. The sound that filled the concert hall was pure magic. Every person in that audience felt it immediately. This wasn't just technically proficient playing. This was music that reached into your chest and grabbed your heart. Music that made you remember things you'd forgotten. Music that made you feel things you'd buried long ago. A woman in the balcony started crying and didn't know why. A man who'd come just to support his daughter in the orchestra found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed. Critics who'd come ready to judge found themselves forgetting to take notes. The boy played like he was telling a story. A story about struggle and hope. About working hard for something you love. About sacrifice and dreams and refusing to give up. Every note meant something. Every phrase carried weight. When he finished the first piece, the applause was thunderous. But he barely heard it. He was already preparing for the second piece, the more challenging one. This one was faster, more complex, more demanding, but he wasn't worried. The music knew where it wanted to go. He just had to follow. The second performance was even better than the first. His fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The piano sang and roared and whispered. The music built to a climax so powerful that several people gasped out loud. And then it was over. The final chord rang out, fading slowly into silence. The boy lifted his hands from the keys and finally looked up at the audience. For a moment, nobody moved. Then everyone stood up at once. The applause was deafening. People were cheering. His mother was sobbing openly. Rodriguez was on his feet, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Even the other orchestra members, kids who'd been his competition, were clapping with genuine admiration. Petrov walked onto the stage and embraced the boy. "Thank you," the director whispered. "Thank you for reminding us what matters." Backstage after the concert, people lined up to meet him. Music teachers asking where he'd studied. Parents asking if he gave lessons. Other kids wanting to know his secret, but there was no secret. Just hours and hours of practice in a basement. Just love for music. Just a boy who found something that made him feel whole and decided to give everything to it. Years passed. The boy continued his studies. He performed in competitions and won awards. He eventually became a celebrated pianist, traveling the world playing in the finest concert halls. But he never forgot where he came from. He started a program to provide free music lessons to kids who couldn't afford them. He donated pianos to schools in poor neighborhoods. He told his story everywhere he went, not to brag, but to inspire. Music finds those who seek it, he'd tell his students. It doesn't matter where you come from or what you have. If you love it enough, if you're willing to work for it, music will meet you halfway. The broken piano from his building's basement was eventually restored and now sits in the conservatory's main hall. There's a plaque on it that reads, "Greatness begins in unexpected places." And sometimes late at night when the conservatory is empty, the boy, now a man, still goes and plays that old piano. Because it reminds him of the most important lesson he ever learned, that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's about taking what's inside you and sharing it with the world, no matter how broken or imperfect the instrument. Director Petrov, retired now, sometimes comes to listen, and every time, he remembers the day a small boy in worn sneakers taught him to fall to his knees, not in mockery but in awe,